What I want is a radical charity that works around global poverty, human rights and climate justice. We work with partners on the front line in the global south, and we run hard-hitting campaigns here in the UK. We very much focus on the root causes of poverty and justice, and we very much believe that change comes through building power and power of people. You don't need to be a climate scientist now to recognise that climate impacts are happening now. We're already at just a warming of just over 1 degree across globally. We have seen killer floods, droughts and famines. In the country where I'm originally from, Pakistan, we've had heat waves of 53.5 degrees centigrade. That is literally at the upper limit of what a human being can tolerate out in the open. And this is a country where 4 out of 10 people face multiple dimensional poverty. This summer we've seen, Indian cities run out of water, and predictions that as the glaciers melt, that up to 40% of people in the Indian subcontinent, that's 1.3 billion people, will be threatened without access to fresh water. We've seen droughts and famines, and of course we've seen the cyclones and supercharged hurricanes that have battered Bermuda, but have battered Dominica and many other places around the world. The reality of climate change is it is not something that will happen in the future. It's happening now. It's killing people now. It's destroying the lives and homes and livelihoods of millions and millions of people. But climate change is also doing something different as well. So it's fueling greater hunger. It's fueling greater poverty. It's increasing on conflict. So all around the world, we see climate change as not only an injustice in itself, but as a flame inflaming all of the existing injustices. Climate change has never been an environmental issue. Right? I mean, having spent over a decade in the UN climate talks itself, working with governments, watching governments and lobbying and standing with the climate justice movements of the global south, the last thing that the climate talks or climate negotiations or climate issue is ever about is the environment. Ultimately, it's about the political economy. It's about an economy that is built on fossil fuel extraction, that is powered by fossil fuels, and it profits multinationals all around the world who are putting profit before people and the planet. And as such, it's both as an issue, it is not and just simply an environmental issue. It is a political issue, it's an economic issue, it is a social justice issue, as well as, of course, it's a climate and environmental issue. But the answers to it are also simply not about an environmental answer. This is not simply about reducing parts per million in the atmosphere or keeping to a certain temperature guardrail, as important as that is. It's about also recognizing that we live in a world where half the world's population, that's 3.5 billion people, survive on less than $5 a day, denied the right to a dignified life. We have over 3 billion people who don't have access to electricity or clean cooking. We have 2 billion people who face issues around hunger. And we have over 1 billion people who don't have access to fresh water. These are deep inequalities, and they're inequalities that are an expression of a broken economic model. And that model has sacrificed people of the global south to extract wealth, both of people and of natural resources. And it is that is driving and fueling climate change. So our answer has to be intersectional. It has to recognize that climate change can't and never will be simply an environmental issue, and that our answers have to be holistic and multidimensional, and therefore our movement also needs to connect these issues. It needs to be able to connect that, recognizing that the predictions are between whether 350 million to 1 billion people being displaced from their homes. The overwhelming majority of those people who will be displaced by climate change will be displaced internally. And what will we in the global north say? People will be labeled as economic migrants. No, we're talking about survival migration. So migrant justice is as important an issue for the climate movement as ending fossil fuels. The same with food. We know that the second biggest source of carbon emissions in the world comes from industrial agribusiness around the world. It's simply not good enough to say, well, we should simply be reducing our meat consumption if the model is still exactly the same. If our consumption is 10 times more than the poorest people in the world, if our business model continues to seize the land, displace people and pollute people's environment, we have to imagine a world that is much, much better, fairer, more equal and more just, and now have the solutions that back that. You can stretch it all the way back, for example, to the doctrine of discovery, when Europe blessed and the Pope and rulers blessed explorers to go and conquest countries of the global south. And what they basically said, that the people who lived there, the indigenous people, the people, black, brown people, were not human and were not citizens, and they could take their land. That justified the extraction of wealth and resources by dehumanizing people. It sacrificed people in the global south. The same thing occurred in slavery. The same thing occurred in colonialism. In the Indian subcontinent, for an example, before the British went to India, India's share of the global economy, GDP, was about 24.4%. When Britain left, it was less than 4%. It's calculated that Britain took out, in real terms now, money up to £45 trillion out of the Indian subcontinent alone, let alone what it took out from the rest of the empire. This is the wealth that was amassed, that has built this country to be the 5th richest economy in the world. So where we are now in neoliberal capitalism, which is basically unfettered corporate power, the ability of corporations to take and access natural resources and exploit them for profit and return those profits back to rich countries, those are all prefaced on the idea of sacrificing people in the global south for profit. And climate change is simply an expression of that. Our challenge is to say that actually everybody in the world has a right to a dignified life, that we stand in solidarity with people on the front line, that our solutions are commensurate with the challenges that face, and they have to be just. And so what we do in this country, and countries that are responsible have a huge responsibility for the climate crisis, is absolutely critical if we want to create that better world, but also if we want to stop the sacrificing of people in the global south. If you take it purely from a science point of view, and so the IPCC's report on the dangers of breaching the 1.5 degree guardrail, where basically if we breach it, we're into tipping points, the impacts that we're seeing around the world will be accelerated, we'll start to have feedback loops, millions more people, in fact billions of more people will be impacted in, and our challenge of being able to address that becomes infinitely harder, and we're on the pathway to really catastrophic climate change where large parts of the world will become uninhabitable. The IPCC scientists said really two key messages. One, that the world needs to be at zero emissions by 2050, right, if we want to stand a chance. And rich countries, to do their fair share, because they've consumed more carbon than poorer countries, should be at zero by 2030. That means every decision we make in the next 10 years will determine how far we breach the 1.5 degree guardrail. And that puts a responsibility on governments and on every policy decision that we make. What will the impact? What will the economic, environmental and social impact, not just in this country, but around globally? And it's that equation that what people are doing is saying that economic benefits to the UK, and we can challenge that whether it is an economic benefit, outweigh the reality of the impacts in terms of the global south. So huge infrastructure projects such as Heathrow are just not compatible. We need to be talking about a much different kind of vision of transport. Look, the reality is we know that it's the majority of flights taken in this country are taken by a rich elite, by a small number of people. We need to be starting talking about, for example, free public transport. We need to be talking about electrified public transport. We need investments on retrofitting every home, so we have warm homes, so people don't have choices between heating or eating. We need to be fixing our food system. There are many, many other projects that this government should be doing and investing money in, rather than expanding Heathrow and sending a sign around the world that it's turning its back on science and it's turning its back on justice. Having worked with many movements in the global south and communities on the front line, who, let me tell you, have never lost hope, who are resisting each and every day and have been resisting. For them, climate change wasn't something that they suddenly woke up to a year or 2 years ago. These are communities that have been fighting for decades against the destructive practices of our extractive industry, of our mining companies, of our multinationals. They've always asked this one question: where is the movement in the UK and in the global north holding your governments to account, your multinationals, your companies which are destroying our lives and our homes and our habitats? And we've not been able to answer that before. We've said there are a few of us, but we have not had this mass movement. We're now at a moment where close, we see around, we see a new emergence of a powerful movement growing where people are demanding action. But we have to go beyond simply saying act. We have to start putting forward a vision, a bold vision, a vision that people can imagine. And we can do it because the solutions all exist to the climate crisis. And the solutions are also the same solutions that will end global inequality. They can be fair and just. We can talk about, energy as a public good. We can talk about the right to food. We can talk about the right to housing, the right for people all around the world to have universal public services, a global NHS and education, that everybody has a right to a dignified life. We have the technology to do it. We have the money to be able to do it. We can do it. Actually, it's much cheaper than the trillions that we invest in fossil fuels and other destructive industries. And actually gives also people a better future. All of those things are possible. What is lacking, and has always been lacking, is the political will. When we look at the mass protests of young people, of Extinction Rebellion, of Fridays for the Youth Climate Strike, all of the potential is there of people coming together, young people and workers, environmentalists, climate justice activists, but also social justice and diaspora and movements of the global south, united by a positive vision. And that's something that War on Want is absolutely critical and works around, is saying we need a vision. We need a global deal for people, one that fixes our world's problems, but doesn't sacrifice people of the global south to allow us to have a clean future.